Lauren Miller had worked every Christmas Eve since Harper was 4. It wasn't that she loved the ER, no one loved what came through those fluorescent lit double doors, but as a single mother and a nurse with bills stacked behind the fridge magnets, holiday shifts meant triple pay and fewer regrets. Or so she told herself. This year, she clocked in just past 6 p.m. Snow clung to the edge of her windshield like a warning. Inside the hospital, heaters hummed, and nurses swapped casseroles in the break room. But the air always smelled faintly of antiseptic and unanswered prayers. Lauren smiled anyway. It was her armor. She passed room 213, where a boy with leukemia was setting up a mini tree with his mom. In 409, a teenager held her grandfather's hand as carols played faintly from her phone. Families, however bruised or broken, found their way back to each other this time of year. But for Lauren, the tradition was reversed. She gave her warmth to strangers and watched her own daughter spend Christmas with people who didn't quite know how to love her right. Harper had been invited to dinner by Lauren's younger sister, Amanda. The Whitmores. Lauren's parents hosted their annual Christmas Eve spread in the kind of house with double staircases and a dining room that smelled like expensive candles and cold civility. They'd never liked Lauren's life choices, nursing single parenting emotional honesty. "You're too dramatic," Eleanor once said, when Lauren cried during a Thanksgiving toast. "Children need structure, not sentiment." Still, Harper had been excited. 16 years old, newly learning to drive, she wore a red velvet dress and had baked gingerbread cookies with cloves and cinnamon sticks. "Do you think they'll like them?" she'd asked, brushing flour from her cheek. Lauren had kissed her forehead, forcing a smile. They'd be lucky to have a taste. Now, as Lauren adjusted IV lines and pressed her palm to a little girl's feverish forehead, she couldn't shake the image of Harper ringing a doorbell that opened with judgment. Her hands moved skillfully. Years of triage had taught her to separate emotion from action, but her heart stayed with her daughter. There were wounds you couldn't suture. Some of them lived in the silence between generations. At 9:42 p.m., Lauren stood at the nurse's station sipping burnt coffee, watching a couple reunite outside the ER doors. The man wore scrubs, the woman a red scarf. They embraced like they'd survived something invisible. She turned away before the tears could rise. Not from jealousy, but from a hollow knowing she wanted that feeling for Harper. A childhood where the adults chose love over decorum. Where no one called her overly sensitive for needing kindness. Where she wouldn't have to wonder if she belonged at her own family's table. Lauren looked down at her phone. No texts. No missed calls. Just a lock-screen photo of Harper at the beach last summer, laughing with windswept hair and sun-warmed cheeks. She whispered to no one in particular, "Let them see her. Just once. Let them see her for who she is." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Lauren stitched wounds and swallowed her own. Tomorrow would be Christmas. But tonight was about getting through the hours with grace and praying that her daughter didn't come home with a new kind of scar. Harper had always loved red. Not the neon kind that screamed for attention, but the warm cranberry kind, the color of deep autumn leaves or a velvet ribbon tied around a book of secrets. Her mother said it suited her soft, but not weak. The dress had been hanging in her closet for weeks, wrapped in tissue paper, like a promise. Lauren had bought it during a rare Saturday off using the last of her overtime check. "It's not designer," she'd said, as Harper held it up to her frame. "But it looks like something worn by a girl who knows she belongs." Now, as Harper stepped in front of her mirror, smoothing the fabric over her hips, she tried to believe that. She dabbed lip balm onto lips that rarely smiled at family functions, tucked her curls behind her ears, and glanced at the clock. 5:42 p.m. She was early. Always was. Always had been. Ever since she was little, Harper had believed that being good, being early, being quiet, being helpful, would somehow make her more lovable, more acceptable, more visible. In the kitchen, the scent of ginger and molasses floated up from the tin of cookies she'd baked with Lauren the night before. She placed a sprig of rosemary on top, a small, elegant touch her mother called rustic charm. Lauren was finishing a phone call with the night nurse. When she hung up, she walked over, looked her daughter up and down, and offered the kind of smile that only mothers carry, the kind that holds both pride and worry. "You look beautiful," she said softly. Harper shrugged. "It's just a dress." Lauren didn't argue. She knew the truth. Sometimes the prettiest dress in the world couldn't protect you from a room full of people who'd already decided who you were. She handed Harper a light coat and the cookie tin. "Here," she said, "don't let them put these in the kitchen until someone actually tastes one. And tell them it's your recipe, not mine. They won't care," Harper said, then caught herself. "Sorry, that sounded mean." "It sounded honest," Lauren replied gently. Then she placed both hands on her daughter's shoulders, grounding her like a lighthouse in a fog. "Listen, sweetheart. If at any moment tonight you feel uncomfortable or invisible, or like you have to shrink to fit in, you call me. I'll come get you." No explanations needed. Harper nodded. "And remember," Lauren added, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "you don't need to try harder to be loved. That's not your job. Love that requires effort to earn isn't love." The words sank somewhere deep in Harper's chest. She didn't know yet how much she'd need them. At exactly 6:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. Amanda's husband was waiting outside in a dark SUV. He didn't get out to greet her, just popped the trunk and sent a quick text. "We're here." Harper turned to Lauren once more before leaving. "Wish me luck." "No," Lauren said. "I wish you truth. Whatever it is, you'll handle it." And with that, Harper stepped out into the snow-lit twilight, her dress catching the last gold of the setting sun, cookies in hand, heart somewhere between hope and hesitation. She had no idea that within 2 hours she'd be standing outside that same door, not with gingerbread in her hands, but with a silence heavier than any suitcase. The Whitmore house had always looked better from the outside, tall columns, manicured lawn, soft golden lights glowing behind tall windows. It was the kind of home that made people say perfect from the driveway. But inside, the warmth was strictly cosmetic. Harper stepped through the door and was immediately greeted by the scent of cranberry glaze and pine-scented candles. Laughter floated down the hall, sharp adult laughter that didn't pause for her entrance. Amanda waved briefly from across the room, balancing a wine glass in one hand and a phone in the other. "You made it," she said without looking up. "Good. Come in." The foyer was crowded, coats piled on a bench, shoes kicked off in a heap. The kind of chaos that should have felt cozy, but didn't. Harper stood still, clutching her tin of cookies. She scanned the room. Her grandmother Eleanor was arranging silverware with surgical precision. Her grandfather Richard carved the roast, silently, eyes down. There were people Harper didn't recognize, Amanda's work friends, probably chatting near the fireplace like they'd always belonged. No one asked her how she was. No one said Merry Christmas. Eleanor looked up just long enough to say, "Harper, darling, can you leave that tin in the kitchen and maybe take a seat in there too? We're a bit tight on space at the main table." The words hung in the air. Harper blinked. "The kitchen. It's warm and it'll be quieter for you," Eleanor added, without a hint of irony. "Plus, we didn't know you'd be coming for sure. You know how last-minute things can get." Harper's chest tightened. "Amanda invited me." Eleanor waved a hand. Yes, it's just been so full this year. You understand. But if you're uncomfortable, dear, there's no shame in heading home. Truly, no shame, just removal." Harper stood in the doorway for another moment. No one else spoke. Amanda didn't look up. Her grandfather continued carving his knife, pressing through turkey-like paper. She left the cookies on the counter, untouched. She didn't cry. Not yet. She turned coat still on her shoulders and stepped back out into the cold without a word. No one followed. No one asked why. No text buzzed her phone. The air outside was sharp biting but honest. She walked to the curb, opened her phone, and stared at Lauren's name. She didn't call. Not yet. She sat on the edge of the curb, red dress bunched under her knees, watching her breath fog in front of her. Inside that house there were 12 chairs, 4 extra guests. and no room for her. But somehow the night air felt kinder. The street was still dark when Lauren pulled into her driveway just after 6:00 a.m. Snow clung to the rooftops like sleep that hadn't quite settled. Her hands were numb from the night shift, but her heart was still alert, uneasy, in a way she couldn't explain. Then she saw it. Harper's car was parked slightly crooked windshield, dusted in frost. That alone wasn't unusual. Harper was still getting the hang of parallel parking. But the porch light was still on, and behind Harper's window the faintest glow bled through the blinds. Lauren stepped inside, shedding her coat without a sound. The house was still too still. No music, no Christmas candle flickering, just silence pressing against the walls like fog. She moved down the hallway and opened Harper's door gently. There she was, still in the red dress curled on top of her comforter arms, around a throw pillow like a child clinging to something that wouldn't leave. Her mascara had left faint tracks down her cheeks. Her eyes were closed but not peacefully swollen, shadowed, pulled tight. Lauren didn't speak at first. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushed a strand of hair from Harper's forehead, and waited. Harper opened her eyes slowly. There was no surprise in them, just fatigue like she'd aged 3 years overnight. "They didn't have a seat for me," Harper whispered, voice hoarse. But there was one for Amanda's friend, and his +1. Lauren said nothing. "I stood there," Harper went on, "in the kitchen, holding the cookies. No one even looked up. Grandma told me if I wasn't comfortable, I could go. So I did." A pause. Her voice broke a little. "They didn't even ask if I made it home." Lauren exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something she'd carried for far too long. She smoothed the edge of Harper's sleeve, then said quietly, "This ends here." Harper blinked. "What do you mean, I mean?" Lauren said. "We're done pretending that crumbs from people who call themselves family are enough. You don't owe anyone a second chance to reject you." Harper stared at her mother, a tear tracing the edge of her temple. "You're not angry?" she asked. "I'm heartbroken," Lauren said. "But no, I'm not angry. I'm awake." She stood, pulled the blanket over her daughter's legs, and whispered one last thing before turning off the light. "They had no room for you at their table. That doesn't mean you don't deserve one. It means it's time we build a new one." As Lauren left the room, dawn was just beginning to break. And for the first time in a long while, the warmth wasn't coming from the house. It was rising from the choice they'd just made. On the morning of December 26th, Lauren sat at the kitchen table, the cursor blinking on a blank email screen like a heartbeat. The sun filtered through the window, catching dust motes in the air. Harper was still asleep, and the house was wrapped in that fragile calm that comes after a storm you didn't see coming, but will never forget. Lauren's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't angry, not in the way that made you shout. This was the kind of anger that had cooled into clarity, sharpened into resolve. What she felt wasn't rage, it was responsibility. She began typing. Subject: "This will be the last time I explain myself. Dear Eleanor, Richard, and Amanda, I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. I'm not even writing this for you. I'm writing this for Harper. Because on Christmas Eve, my daughter, the kindest, most thoughtful person I've ever known, stood in your home in a red velvet dress, holding cookies she made by hand, and was told there was no room for her. You didn't forget her, you excluded her, and the worst part, no one noticed when she left. No one checked if she got home safe. Not one of you reached out. She's 16, a child, my child. So let me make something painfully clear. If you cannot treat my daughter with respect, with dignity, with basic human decency, then you do not have a place in either of our lives. This isn't a punishment. This is a boundary. Love, when it's real, doesn't ask someone to shrink themselves for a seat at the table. Harper will never again have to earn affection from people who refuse to see her. I won't ask for an apology. I won't ask you to explain. I'm not here to beg. We're choosing peace. Lauren. She read it twice, then once more slower. Then she hit send. The silence afterward was deafening, but clean, like air after rain. She didn't cry. There were no dramatic tears, No slammed doors, just the quiet click of a mother closing the chapter on inherited harm. Days passed. No reply. Not from Eleanor, who would have called her emotional. Not from Richard, who likely passed the message off to drama. And not from Amanda, who had a way of disappearing when things got uncomfortable. Harper didn't mention it. Not directly. But Lauren saw her daughter check her phone more often, saw the way she scrolled through her messages, fingers still, eyes unreadable. One evening, Harper asked casually, "Did Grandma say anything?" Lauren shook her head gently. "No. And that says everything." Harper nodded, then looked out the window. The Christmas lights on the neighbor's porch blinked silently in the dark. No one likes to admit it, but sometimes silence is the answer. And sometimes that answer frees you. The house was quiet again, days after the email had been sent and swallowed by silence. Outside, snow had begun to crust at the edges of the driveway, turning slush gray and brittle. Inside, the heat hummed softly, and Lauren sat on the living room floor, sorting through old boxes of photographs and college paperwork, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Harper needed a form for school, and it had led her here back into the archives of a life she rarely spoke about. One envelope slid open, aged yellowed edges curling. Inside was her acceptance letter to NYU Law. It had once been a dream, but not hers. She remembered the day it came her mother Eleanor's red lipstick, the clink of ice in her glass, the way she announced it to guests like an award she had personally won. "My daughter, a future attorney," she'd said, smiling wide. Brains and beauty finally put to good use. Lauren had smiled too tightly, because what no one knew was that 2 weeks earlier, she'd also been accepted into the nursing program at Columbia. The letter still smelled like ink and possibility. She had hidden it under her mattress, like a secret diary. Nursing wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something the Whitmores spoke about at dinner parties. It was, according to Eleanor, a common job. A plan B for girls who didn't know better. Lauren knew otherwise. She'd known since she was 12, sitting in an ER beside her best friend's mother, watching nurses move through chaos with calm hands and clear eyes. She wanted that. Not applause, purpose, but when she told her mother, Eleanor's face had gone cold. "You want to take temperatures and wipe old men's mouths," she said. "Is that what you're throwing your life away for?" Lauren didn't answer. She didn't argue. She just packed her bag, deferred NYU Law, and enrolled anyway. It took years for the disappointment to dull, not Lauren's, but Eleanor's. And now, decades later, that same judgment had shown up at Harper's doorstep, dressed in nicer clothes, but carrying the same venom. "Sit in the kitchen. If you're uncomfortable, go. No room, no regard." One night not long after Christmas, Harper had asked her the question, quietly while rinsing dishes. "Mom," she said, "did Grandma ever treat you the way she treated me?" Lauren had hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew how much it would hurt to say it out loud. Still, she owed Harper the truth. "Worse," she said simply. "But I made a promise to myself, that it would end with me, that you'd never wonder whether you mattered." Harper had nodded, lips pressed together. She didn't cry. She just handed her mother the dish towel and kept drying. Lauren looked at her, now 16 and braver than she'd ever been at that age, and she felt it like a vow deep in her chest. This wasn't just about Christmas. It was about every little girl who'd ever been made to feel like a burden in her own home. But not this one. Not Harper. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon, not frantic, not loud, but steady, intentional. Lauren had just taken banana bread out of the oven. Harper was upstairs with music playing faintly behind her bedroom door. Neither of them expected anyone. When Lauren opened the front door, the winter air slipped in first and then her father. Richard Whitmore stood on the porch in a navy wool coat, hands at his sides, not holding anything. No flowers, no wrapped gifts, no performative apology. Just him. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Lauren stepped aside but said nothing. He walked into the warmth like someone entering holy ground for the first time in years, slow, unsure if he belonged. He looked older than she remembered, softer around the eyes. Or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly now. I didn't come to defend what happened, he said, standing near the couch, but not sitting. And I'm not here to ask for a second chance. I want to talk. And to listen. If she'll let me. Lauren folded her arms. She won't, she said. Not today. He nodded. I thought she might not. Lauren's voice stayed even. She was humiliated in your house, on a holiday that's supposed to be about belonging, and all of you let it happen. Richard exhaled the breath, shaky. I know, and I've been thinking about it every day since. There was a long silence. She looked so much like you in that moment, he added softly. Back when you were her age, standing in a room full of people who didn't see her. I should have said something. I didn't. That's on me. Lauren looked at him. Her father, the man who had kept his head down when her mother dismissed her, who'd passed the salt in silence, while she swallowed hurt. She doesn't need words right now, Lauren said. She needs space and safety. Richard lowered his gaze. I understand. Lauren walked him to the door. Before he left, she added, but I also told her something last night and I meant it. He paused on the porch. We don't forgive people because they deserve it, she said. We forgive because we deserve peace. He nodded, eyes rimmed in regret. If she ever wants to talk, he whispered, I'll be here, even if it takes years. And then he left no dramatic exits, no last words. Just the crunch of footsteps on snow and the soft click of the door behind him. Upstairs, Harper didn't ask who it was. Lauren didn't offer. But that night, Harper sat next to her on the couch, a little closer than usual, her head on her mother's shoulder. Sometimes healing didn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looked like boundaries held gently but firmly. The invitation came on a Thursday. A short text from Amanda, unusually direct, brunch, just us three. Sunday. Lauren read it twice before showing it to Harper. Her daughter shrugged, not with resistance, but guarded curiosity. She said, just us three. Harper murmured. Not Grandma and Grandpa. Lauren shook her head. Just Amanda. Harper paused, then gave a small nod. Okay. They chose a quiet cafe just outside the city, one of those tucked-away places where the waitstaff knew your name and the syrup came in warm porcelain pitchers. When they arrived, Amanda was already seated by the window, stirring cream into her coffee, like it gave her something to do with her hands. She stood when she saw them, smiled softly. Harper looked taller, somehow more grown, and Amanda's smile faltered with emotion she couldn't quite hide. I wasn't sure if you'd come, she said. Lauren took the seat across from her. Harper sat beside her mother, polite but reserved. Amanda ordered pancakes for the table, the kind we used to have when we were kids, she said. And then she let the silence settle like batter on a griddle, slow and hot and inevitable. Finally, she spoke. I want to say something that I should have said a long time ago. She began, voice uneven. I've been so caught up in trying to survive in our family that I forgot to ask how I was affecting yours. Harper looked down at her hands. Amanda reached across the table not to touch, but to offer a gesture of openness. I didn't stand up for you, Harper. And I didn't protect you, Lauren. I was complicit in all the small silences that made both of you feel small. I'm not proud of that. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want to try to do better. If you'll let me. Lauren glanced at Harper, giving her the space to answer if she chose. Harper spoke quietly. I don't know how to forget it, but I want to know if you meant it. I do, Amanda said. I just don't know how to get it right, but I want to learn. The waitress arrived with stacks of pancakes, golden warm, dusted with powdered sugar, the kind they hadn't eaten together in years. They ate slowly. Conversation lightened. Harper even laughed once, soft and quick, like a bird taking flight. Then, just as the check arrived, Eleanor appeared. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance. She walked to the table with deliberate steps, clutching her purse with both hands. Lauren's heart tensed. May I? Eleanor asked. Amanda nodded, slightly unsure. Eleanor didn't sit. She reached into her purse and pulled out something small. A worn photo edges curled, colors fading. It was Harper. Maybe 3 years old face, sticky with frosting, laughing at something off camera. "I've had this in my wallet," Eleanor said, her voice soft but sure. "Since she was born." She placed it gently on the table in front of Harper. Then she looked at her granddaughter for the first time, not as a disruption, but as a person. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to, not yet. But she came, and she brought a piece of the past that said, "You were never invisible, just mishandled." Harper picked up the photo. Her fingers lingered on the edge. "I look happy," she whispered. "You were," Lauren said. And as the pancakes cooled and coffee refilled, something else rose in the space between them, not trust, not quite, but the first ingredients of it, something like a beginning. The attic had always been the forgotten part of the house, full of dusty boxes, mismatched furniture, and old Christmas decorations no one had bothered to sort. But to Harper, it was potential, it was quiet, and most of all, it was hers. It started as a casual mention one Saturday morning. A school photography project was coming up, and she needed somewhere to shoot. Lauren had offered the basement, but Harper hesitated. "I want light," she said, "real light, but also space for shadows." Richard, who had been stopping by every other weekend, not pushing, just present, spoke up. "The attic," he said. "We can make it work." And so they did. He came with work gloves, plywood, and an old set of his father's tools. Together they swept and hammered, measured and painted. Harper hung thick blackout curtains to build her own darkroom, and Lauren brought up a coffee machine. "Every artist needs fuel," she joked. But it was more than a studio. It was a space Harper claimed without apology, a place where her thoughts had weight and her voice mattered. Her project took form quickly. She called it Absence, a series of portraits without faces. A plate untouched, a chair slightly askew, a pair of shoes at the door, one missing its pair. Each photo whispered grief, but none screamed it. They simply stood stark and honest, a testament to what it feels like to be excluded in a room full of people pretending not to notice. Richard helped frame the final prints. When he saw the one Harper titled Kitchen Seat, he looked at it for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. Harper didn't respond right away, but she didn't turn away either. "Thank you for helping with this," she finally said. The piece was submitted to the statewide Student Arts Showcase, an event usually dominated by bold colors and over-processed portraits. Harper's photos stood quietly among them, almost understated, and they won. First prize. At the awards ceremony, a local journalist pulled Harper aside. What inspired the series, she asked, holding a recorder. Harper didn't fumble or look at her mom for guidance. She simply said, "It came from a day I realized I had the right to exist." The interviewer blinked, caught off guard. Harper smiled. Not cocky, just steady. At 16, she'd found the words her mother had once swallowed. Lauren, standing nearby, felt something loosen in her chest. Not because Harper had won, but because she had spoken her truth without shrinking. And that attic, once forgotten, had become a place where shadows could stand still long enough to be seen. The house smelled of cinnamon, roasted vegetables, and something sweet in the oven. Maybe apple crumble, maybe gingerbread. Lauren couldn't remember the last time Christmas felt this calm. Not quiet exactly. There was music playing from a Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen, some mix of old holiday jazz and Harper's favorite indie acoustic covers. Laughter echoed from the living room, where a few co-workers from Lauren's hospital shift were swapping ridiculous ER stories with her neighbor Joy, who'd brought homemade cornbread and inappropriate jokes in equal measure. Harper, now 17, moved comfortably between guests, topping off drinks, sneaking bites of toffee, catching up with her best friend Jess, who'd stayed over the night before. She wore a soft gray sweater, no makeup, and that same silver pendant Lauren had given her on her last birthday, the one engraved with enough. There was no grand tree, just a modest pine by the window strung with handmade ornaments, paper stars, and lights that glowed like fireflies. There were no speeches, no showy gifts, just warmth. Love shown not in performances, but in presence. At some point, Harper grabbed her camera. "Stay still," she told Lauren, who was adjusting the napkins. "Don't pose, just be." Lauren looked up mid-laugh and their eyes met. Click. The flash was subtle, but the moment landed like a heartbeat caught on film. Later that night, when the guests had left and dishes were stacked in the sink, Harper showed her the photo. In it, Lauren stood next to the tree hands dusted with flour, smile soft, and a little surprised. The lights behind her blurred into golden circles, and her eyes held something between joy and awe. "You look like you," Harper said simply. Lauren touched the edge of the photo. "So do you." They didn't talk about last year. They didn't need to. They had built something new, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. A dinner where everyone had a seat, yes. But more importantly, a space where both mother and daughter felt seen. And Harper, without meaning to, whispered the final line. "This year," she said, slipping the photo into a frame, "you and I, we both belong. Not just at the table, but in each other's hearts." Lauren wiped away a tear, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from something quieter, something whole.